working to lift up trauma-informed policy around healing and alternatives to incarceration, given the need to adjust based on locality? Can you point to some good practices being used in certain communities?
Where we are seeing an over-policing of youth of color, especially Black girls, who are subject to, lots of racial and gender biases through, there was a great report by Georgetown Law Center and Jamila Blake and Rebecca Epstein that talked about this concept as adultification, that Black girls are perceived as less innocent, more knowledgeable about sex, promiscuous, right? And as a result, it impacts the ways in which adults and systems interact with them. And so we routinely see the over-policing of normal adolescent behaviors, which land girls in trouble, school suspensions, and ultimately in the justice system. But then we see this incredible underprotection when girls experience violence at these astronomical rates. Like we talked about, 60% of Black girls experience sexual abuse before 18. Native women and girls experience astronomical rates of violence, and usually at the hands of a non-Native person. And then there's no accountability. So I think, we have to be very nuanced in our responses to questions like these, because alternatives to incarceration and, just being mindful of the types of responses we need to hold that our system reacts to different groups of people very distinctly, and that some people are afforded certain protections and are deemed, worthy and valuable and therefore entitled to safety and protection, whereas others are not and are discarded. So I think that's just an important nuance to hold when we are, thinking about policies like that.
There's a school in Oakland, California called Emerge, which was created to really interrupt what folks and Dr. Monique Morris articulates as the confinement to college pathways that could exist actually. Like that there is actually another side to the sexual abuse to prison pipeline, which is how do you take the innate resilience and strength of, we heard Cara and Melanie, when they introduced themselves, talk about how their lived experiences are actually what make them, in addition to all of the incredible work that they've been doing, give them a particular wisdom. And so the question is looking at strategies that take that wisdom and transfer it to be able to access the excellence that is in girls and gender expansive youth of color. And I use that particular school because it's specifically for young people, for girls who have experienced juvenile justice, the juvenile justice system, and or have experienced have been pushed out of school due to particular policies and practices and biases that they've experienced. And what strategies like that do is it's not necessarily, I think it's a beautiful alternative to incarceration, is really give young people safe places to be. When you see young people running away, ask them what they're running from or what they're running to.
We did a survey through the state's largest nonprofit service provider and identified around 100 people who met the criteria for sex trafficking. And 27% reported that they had first been coerced into exchanging sex for drugs. So, and 44% stated that they had struggled with addiction, prior to or during that experience. And we know that the first drug use happens really young with our sex trafficked youth. And usually, right, it's just a way to cope with unbearable violence in their lives. And so there is a very strong overlay between between criminalization, right? Because like Yasmin noted, even we have to decriminalize those who are being exploited, period, immediately. That's without question. But it still doesn't reduce police involvement because we see such high levels of drug use, among people who are coping with all of this. And so, or being forced to do that as a control mechanism. So yeah, I think that it's really important, and it's a centerpiece of how we're struggling with this, especially because in Hawaii, we don't have treatment for youth. And so we send them to the continental United States, children without their families, to another continent. It's unbelievable. So it's a big part of this story. Thank you for bringing that up.
And I'll just add one point, kind of tying it back to the missing and murdered Indigenous women. I mean, we do these judicial trainings, as Maheen said, and we do a lot of kind of technical assistance. And, you know, when we talk about things like trauma, we expand it to, you know, talk about the gendered nature of trauma, right? One of the things that Dr. Stephanie Covington talks about is, you know, when men and, you know, male identifying people experience trauma, it's often more indiscriminate. But when women and female identifying people experience trauma and violence, it's most often at the hands of somebody they know, and, you know, often who tells them, I love you. And so they manifest and respond to trauma differently. And so we also talk about historical and intergenerational trauma. And I think that's particularly important when we look at Indigenous and Black populations in the United States and the ways in which that is carried down. You know, epigenetics, I think, is very real. And so substance abuse is a very, you know, common coping mechanism, particularly among Indigenous women and girls here in the United States and elsewhere, who, you know, many of whom, the majority of whom have suffered sexual abuse and violence, many of whom have experienced life in the sex trade. And so, you know, I think when you talk about those intersections of gender justice, racial justice, and substance abuse, it's just too common a narrative that I think all of us see and hear in the women and girls that we have worked with and that we know, personally. So I think that's a really great question, and I thank you for raising it.